joining us once again. He hasn't been with us for a while. We're delighted to have him back. Stephen Miles is the Advocacy Director of Win Without War. Stephen, thanks for joining us. Now, just as a quick reminder for folks who might not have heard you on the show for a while, give us a sort of elevator pitch of what a Win Without War is.
Sure. Win Without War is a national coalition of about 36 national groups like Move On, Credo, the United Methodist Church, others, that came together back in 2002, originally in opposition to the war in Iraq, and have stayed together advocating for progressive national security solutions and an end to the over-militarization of our foreign policy.
Okay, great. Perfect. And there's a lot in that area to be discussed because there's a lot going on. And thanks for coming on the show and talking about it. I'd like to start a little bit with an update on what's going on in Iraq and general environs, especially with the ISIS situation there. First of all, should we still call it ISIS? I hear people, especially in the Arab world, saying that it's wrong to just use the Islamic State acronym, ISIS, and secondly, that people in that part of the world preferred rather to call it Daesh, which is the Arabic pronunciation of the acronym, but also sounds a little bit like, I think, an impolite Arabic word. So should we start calling it Daesh?
You know, I think this is an interesting case where we have no consensus on what to call these guys, and I think the more important reality is that it doesn't matter much, in my perspective, what you call them. You can call them ISIS, you can call them IS, you can call them Daesh. We're talking about the same group of folks, but at the same time, it's actually inevitably a shorthand way of referring to what is a much more complex problem, and in reality is actually a multitude of different fighting groups that are fighting together at times in alliances that are shifting by the hour. So there's a core group of folks that we can call ISIS, Daesh, led by a gentleman named al-Baghdadi. But actually the larger context, the larger conflict going on both in Iraq and Syria involves many, many, many more parties, many more groups with various different names that Americans have never even heard of. And it does us a disservice when we focus for too long on any one particular aspect of this, because the complexity of this problem, of this conflict, is something that is at the core of understanding for what we need to do about it.
All right, fair enough. And we call the right-wing group in this country Tea Party patriots, even though they're not a political party, and I don't consider them patriots. So I guess, exactly. What's in a name. So let's call them ISIS for the sake of clarity, since that's what most people know them as. Mm-hmm. And let's say, aside from the horrific killings and so on, the acts of violence, which everybody knows about, what I don't think people know about is the current state of play in terms of their control of territory, the military campaigns against them, and so on, and the fact that, of course, that covers more than one country. So how are things going in the battle against ISIS in Iraq?
You know, you mentioned at the outset that it's been a while since we talked. The sad reality is that the contours of the conflict on the ground are not dramatically changed from the last time that we talked. There's a large swath of area between Damascus and Baghdad, primarily populated by Sunni Arabs, that ISIS holds what could be best described as control or sway over, but again, is actually a lot more complicated than that. This is kind of, if you will, eastern Syria, western and northern Iraq. The general contours of that area have not changed that much since kind of the dramatic advances we saw last year in the summer around the fall of Mosul and whatnot. There's been some particularly visible changes. There was a major battle, I'm sure folks remember, for a town in Syria called Kobani. ISIS has been finally pushed out of that area over a long period of time. There's some areas at the kind of dividing line between Kurdish areas of Iraq and Sunni areas of Iraq that have gone back and forth. There's similarly areas between the Shia area in the southern Iraq and near Baghdad and the Sunni areas. Those areas have gone back and forth in terms of who controls them. But again, control is probably the wrong term here. It can change by the hour. It could change by the minute at times. And so the fundamental contours of the conflict that are kind of not caught up in who's got their flag over this town or that town, that hasn't changed. And what you have is a major conflict going on with significant fighting every day between primarily the Sunnis in Iraq and Shia and Kurds in various different configurations, and Sunnis and other allies against the Assad regime and its allies in Syria. One of the few things that has changed in Syria is we've seen a fairly significant collapse of the quote-unquote moderate opposition. This is the kind of famed army that seems to only have ever existed in John McCain's head, that was going to be this pro-Western force that was going to rise up and at the same time defeat ISIS and defeat Assad. What's become clear is that those forces, to the extent that they ever existed, are dwindling by the day, and we continue to have a strong secular opposition in Syria, some of which is taken up arms, some of which hasn't taken up arms. But the fighting in Syria predominantly is being dominated by ISIS, by the Syrian regime and allies from Hezbollah and Iran, and then also by other extremist Sunni groups like groups that are affiliated with Al Qaeda and whatnot.
So now we have, and I'm just trying to. Clearly, it's a complex issue. I'm just trying to get a handle on it. We're talking to Stephen Miles of Win Without War. Let's start with Iraq. People, just to remind people, it's a Shiite majority country. It's a Sunni minority country. Iraq, ISIS covers a fair amount of territory. I'm not sure how a large amount of territory, some of which is thinly populated. But to what extent is this conflict, starting with Iraq and then maybe in Syria as well, it gets characterized as about extremism, and certainly they are extreme, and the ISIS group. But to what extent is this about religious extremism per se, and to what extent is it about tribal differences?
It's about both. And I think we have to put the term extremist in context. Look, by any rational measure, these folks are extremists. This is a particularly gruesome form of violence. It's something that rightly shocks the conscience of mankind when we see individuals beheaded, when we see individuals burned alive. These are atrocities that we all rightly condemn. They're also atrocities that frankly, I think are frightening to Western audiences when we view them in very slickly produced videos like the ones ISIS puts out. What they're not, unfortunately, is abnormal in a conflict that has now raged for several decades. We've seen, unfortunately, an escalating pattern of atrocity after atrocity, mass killings, beheadings, group torture, rape, all of the kind of gruesome, brutal images and conflicts that we've seen in war, and unfortunately continuing to get worse over time. So it does continue to get worse, let's make no mistake about that. But we've been seeing this kind of sectarian violence, and we've been seeing it really in earnest since 2003. And that's important to remember here. This didn't just come out of nowhere. This came out of forces that were at least in part unleashed by the decision of the George Bush administration to invade Iraq and unleash a massive wave of sectarian bloodletting that continues to this day. And even if we eliminated every fighter on the battlefield that identified with ISIS, this sectarian bloodletting would continue tomorrow as well. And until we address that conflict, until we address that sectarian violence and those sectarian divides, some of which are tribal, some of which are religious, some of which are, at this point, blood feuds after decades and years of conflict. There's lots of different individual reasons. But until we get to a point where we're getting at the underlying challenges, we're just going to be changing the name of who we talk about doing the killing.
Well, I think this is so important because we're talking with Stephen Miles of Win Without War. I think this is so important because, I think sometimes we get fixated as a media nation on the understandably riveting, horrific images. But if we want those horrific scenes to end, we have to look at the underlying causes, some of the causes you just described. So it's not a matter. I mean, I've talked to many people on the left, for example, who will say after the latest horrific revelation out of ISIS, well, I've said I don't want more military involvement in Iraq, but we got to get boots on the ground to take these guys out. I think there are two things implicit, but I want to explore them with you in what you just said, both of which are extremely important. And the first is that response, while understandable on a human level, won't work. It will continue the situation. As you say, even if we manage to kill every single ISIS fighter, it would prolong that situation. And I want to talk a little bit about that. And secondly, that unless we have a solution that instead of prolonging it addresses the root causes, this will also go on indefinitely. First of all, have I sort of paraphrased you correctly?
You have, yeah, absolutely.
So let's start with the first one. Clearly, whatever horrible aspects of Saddam Hussein, we all understand there was a form of stability in that country, and that was destroyed by our invasion with no thought about what might replace it. And now, and there was, of course, then the violence of the invasion and occupation itself and the sort of aftermath of that. So now here we are. Why is further military involvement on our part counterproductive?
Well, and I'm really glad you framed this up, RJ. It's not because we want to look back and we want to say, we were right, you guys were wrong, isn't that great? It's because we need to look at our history of involvement and understand what works and what doesn't, what's counterproductive and what's productive. And we also need to understand what we can actually influence and what we can't. One of the things we really have to do is break ourselves of this notion that there's something that we can do in Washington that is going to bring peace and stability to 50 million people in the Middle East. There are things we can do to make the situation better. There are things we can do to make the situation worse. But there is no piece of legislation that Congress is going to pass that is going to end what is now years of conflict, what is massive bloodletting, what is a deeply complex situation that folks in Washington don't even understand, let alone have the ability to influence. So we really have to break ourselves of that notion that we have all the answers, because out of that, we end up in a vain quest to find all the answers, and inevitably we end up back with American military might, because that's the easiest, most readily available option. I think.
Okay, so, but as I want to explore a little bit after the break, that will, in fact, just as far as I understand it, prolong the cycle of violence, when what we need to do is get to the root causes and break it. So let's take a break now, and when we get back, talk a little bit more about the ISIS situation, where we might go with that if we were smarter, and where they may go with it if left unchecked. But first, this break, I am Richard RJ Eskow. We're talking to Stephen Miles of Win Without War. We'll be right back after this. This is the Zero Hour. And we are back on the Zero Hour. We are talking with Stephen Miles, Advocacy Director of Win Without War. And we've been talking about the situation with ISIS in Iraq and Syria. Now, those are two separate global pictures, Iraq and Syria. So our great temptation is to step in and put more boots in the ground or continue the bombing campaigns. But that's not going to get to the root cause of this problem here. What will?
Well, before we talk about what will, and I want to answer that question directly, we have to flag one more thing, which is that ISIS wants nothing more than American military personnel to be sent back in. They want to go back to killing American soldiers like they were doing when they were called Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and they were doing for years and years and years during the Iraq War. They have been orchestrating a propaganda campaign to try to convince America to put soldiers back in on the ground so they could kill them. So we need to remember that this isn't happening in a vacuum, that this is exactly what they want. But you're exactly right to turn the question to what will. Well, again, part of what we have to do is resist the urge to think that we have a magic silver bullet that's going to solve this problem. We don't. We should acknowledge that. We should understand that the search of that magic silver bullet is a fool's errand. But there are things that we know that will work, and there are things that we know that will make the situation worse. So, the old adage, when you're in a hole, stop digging, right? We're in a hole. We've been bombing Iraq for 4 presidents. We're now setting up to get ready for a presidential election that will decide who the 5th president in a row who gets to bomb Iraq will be. If bombing Iraq and now bombing Syria was going to make those countries stable or secure or democratic or less of a threat to us, it would have worked by now. It has, in fact, done the exact opposite. That region is much more dangerous for America. That region is much more unstable than it has been. And our military action there has been destabilizing. So when you start there, and then you take a step back and you say, let's look at these conflicts. You have a civil war in Syria on which there has been brutal, horrific crimes on all sides. There needs to be a solution to that civil war. That solution is going to involve folks that we don't like to deal with, Russia, Iran, others. But we have to figure out what the solution is. What is the way that the fighters in that civil war can lay down their arms, can end the civil wars the way almost every civil war does, with some sort of imperfect, messy political solution that allows folks to begin to work out their political differences, not at the barrel of a Kalashnikov, but at some sort of political process. And we need to do a similar concept in Iraq. We need to begin to have a process where Sunnis in Iraq, by and large, who have nothing to do with ISIS. Let's remember, ISIS is somewhere 20, 30,000 fighters in a population of 20 million Sunnis. But right now, we've driven Sunnis into the arms of ISIS. We've said that you are in a sectarian war against Shiites, and you have to stand with the strongest militia that's on your side, which is ISIS. Sunnis in Iraq, former Baathists, former members of the Saddam regime, Sunni tribes, others, they need to be given a pathway that allows them to turn their guns on ISIS. Some of ISIS won't lay down their guns. They're going to have to be defeated by someone. But we need to have a solution where they're going to be on a side for peace, on a side that has a future, and on a side that's against the type of horrific violence that we're seeing. And until we do, this problem is going to continue.
So I think there will be people who say to that, and I want to just speak to the various objections we might hear,
Sure.
that there's no negotiating with people who commit such barbaric acts. But in fact, I look back at something like the much celebrated surge, which the media called quite a victory. Now, the surge, in fact, involved a lot of negotiating with and paying of tribal leaders who I don't think were enormously less violent or brutal or medieval than ISIS. They may not have directed it against Americans or shown up on our television screens, but isn't this, in fact, an accepted practice that unless you're going to eliminate entire populations, you have to negotiate with the fighters among them sometimes?
Yeah. No, that's absolutely right. A huge part of what happened in the so-called surge was what's commonly called the Anbar Awakening. It was, and again, it's the same players, it's the same tribes, it's the same militants that were then Al-Qaeda in Iraq and are ISIS now. They were driven away, the Sunni tribes were driven away from them through a process of working with American military forces, through a process of sometimes paying their salaries, paying kind of inducements to them, but convincing them that there was a path forward for them in Iraq that was not on the backs of the type of brutality that then Al-Qaeda in Iraq and today ISIS conducted. It's not hard to imagine that people don't want to live in that kind of world. And we see these reports that get snuck out of ISIS-controlled territory that people aren't particularly happy living in this type of horrific situation. But they need to be offered an alternative. They need to know that what happened after the Anbar Awakening, which was that Shia militias returned, they were purged from the government. They were purged from the military. Their salaries stopped being paid. They had no future in the Iraqi state. They need to know that that's not going to happen. They need to know that there is a path forward for them. But again, they need to find a way that they can politically live in their country. And that is not something we can decide for other people. Maybe Iraq should be one country, maybe it should be 3. I don't know. And I know that Washington doesn't know. And I know that that's a decision that Iraqis have to make for themselves. We should be supporting Iraqis and Syrians figuring out the solution to those decisions, de-escalating the violence, and also taking care of the massive, massive humanitarian crisis that's going on. There are right now millions of people who are displaced, who have no food, who are not getting any education, who are in danger every day for starvation. That is prime population for extremists to radicalize. If you want to look at this conflict and think about ISIS getting more than 1,000 fighters recruited every month, understand that that recruitment is bred out of the type of humanitarian crisis we see. So if you don't solve that humanitarian crisis, you can never kill as many militants as they will be able to create.
Well, I think that's unfortunately true, and I guess I would add to that I would imagine time is of the essence. The sooner we can change direction, the better. But let's speak candidly for a second. We're talking with Stephen Miles of Win Without War. How realistic is it politically in this country that we can change this sort of war footing with the Republicans in Congress, especially, to one of a more realistic attempt to address the humanitarian crisis and de-escalate and get some negotiations going?
Well, look, I mean, I think we have to have a couple of honest, frank political conversations and realities, and one of them is acknowledging that there's a fire right now, and that part of what needs to happen is that fire has to be put out. If you think of the Middle East as kind of a house being on fire, there's going to need to be some sort of fire department response. But we also need to think about how this fire started and how in 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 years, we're not back having the same conversation about how did we get here, how do we solve these problems, what do we do. That is actually a winnable debate and a winnable argument for progressives to have, because that's where the American people are. The American people get that 14 years of war in the Middle East has not made this problem better. In fact, it's made it worse. And so while there are threats, while ISIS does pose some challenges to us, and those threats need to be dealt with, we need to defend against any type of attacks that we could see, any type of plots that could emanate out of here. We also need to make sure that 14 years from now, we're not having this same conversation. And so we need to be confident and willing to lead in that debate as progressives, even if there's a vote in Congress that we don't win. We are setting up what will happen in the next several years, and that's very much a winnable debate.
Well, and absolutely, and I think that once people look back and see who's made the right argument, that will help, even if the vote goes, as you say, the wrong way. Now, last question about ISIS. They're in Syria, they're in Iraq. I've seen a couple national security analyses suggesting that they've tried a couple attacks along the border of Saudi Arabia. And I've even seen some analyses that pose scenarios where they might ultimately get a foothold in that country as well, which would be have enormous global implications and implications for the United States. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's definitely there's two things here. There's concerns about kind of ISIS, the folks who are in Iraq and Syria, expanding their reach into whether it's Jordan or Turkey. And we should remember in this conversation, Turkey is a NATO ally that we have a treaty obligation to defend, or moving into Lebanon or Jordan or kind of other places like that. There's also a different phenomenon, which is militant extremist groups in other parts of the world who are now kind of switching their allegiance, and they used to say they were part of Al-Qaeda, and today they say they're part of ISIS. And some of them, frankly, have very localized fights against the governments where they are. Some of them aspire to be international, but it is different than kind of the expansion of the core of what is ISIS in Iraq and Syria. These are things that should be concerning, but it's also a reminder that you can't bomb your way out of this problem, because at its core, it is an ideology, it is a series of beliefs, and even if you believed, which is impossible and insane, but if you believed you could kill all of these guys who call themselves ISIS fighters, there would still be people who believed in radical ideologies, in this perverted view of Islam, in this notion that through fear, through mass murder and death, that you can somehow sow the seeds of a different society. And until we find ways to combat that, until we find ways to convince people not to be drawn to that type of radical ideology, until we find ways to address underlying problems like massive unemployment, the loss of water. I have a colleague who loves to talk about Yemen's destabilization is directly linked to the fact that in a couple decades, Yemen will be out of water. If you think about what that does to a society, until we start to find ways to address these problems, it will be susceptible to that ideology, and there's no amount of American bombs that's going to make that problem go away.
Well, you're absolutely right. And I think that in addition, and I do want to talk after the break, maybe for a minute or so about Lebanon, and there is also, about Yemen, but in terms of Lebanon, we have, the death of the horrific death of the pilot there. We have the king allegedly flying a sortie himself as a pilot. Is internal terrorism there done in the name of ISIS by a group that allies itself with ISIS, I suppose could also have enormous global impact. So we need to turn this around as quickly as we can, right?
Mm-hmm. I think that's right.
Okay, so when we get back, if you can stay with us for one more segment, I want to talk just a little bit about Yemen and also about the situation with the Iran negotiations and Bibi Netanyahu, his invitation to Congress. So we will be right back after this with Stephen Miles, Advocacy Director of Win Without War. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour. And we are back on The Zero Hour. I'm Richard RJ Eskow. We are talking with Stephen Miles, Advocacy Director of Win Without War. And let's switch, Stephen, to Yemen for a second. I'll give you my quick brain dump on Yemen. Rebels taking over the capital, taking over the government fleeing. These rebels, as I understand it, are Shiites representing, or from a group that represents about 1/3 of the population. They're now in control, meaning that there's chaos and instability. It is not a stable kind of takeover from the looks of things. We don't seem to have a solution there. As you mentioned, not many years away from a lack of water in that country. And I can't imagine our drone attacks have helped the situation much. So what have I gotten right, and what should we know about Yemen?
Well, a couple of different things. I mean, one, I think you hit on it there at the end there. The drones and bombing of Yemen is something that the U.S. has been doing for over a decade now. I think sometimes we underestimate the psychological effects of little robots flying in the air and dropping hellfire missiles out of the sky and bringing death and destruction. However one feels about the people on the receiving end of that, the instability that it breeds in a society to know that at any moment a missile could come flying out of the air is just something that no one in the U.S., frankly, lives with. And I think it's very difficult to understand how destabilizing it is, but it's very, very clear that it's destabilizing. It's been very destabilizing in Pakistan for similar reasons. Mm-hmm. But we also need to understand that the situation in Yemen, again, is very complex. This is a country that 25 years ago was not a country. It was two countries. And there was an experiment of trying to make it into one country. Like much of the Middle East, the boundary lines are highly arbitrary. We usually talk about the British and the French drawing them up 100 years ago. In this case, that was compounded with the kind of unification of part that was formerly communist and part that wasn't. And what's apparent is that there's some real differences of opinion in Yemen. There's some real disagreements between the various parts of the population, and it's not entirely clear that they all want to live together in one country. It's very hard for me to sit in Washington and make assertions about whether they're right, whether they're wrong, whether the Houthis, who are the Shia group you alleged earlier, or you referenced earlier, whether the Houthis should be living with the other Sunni Yemeni tribes, whether the folks who live in the port down on the coast have much in common with the folks who live much more nomadic tribal life in the kind of inner parts of the country and the mountainous parts of the country. We don't necessarily know, but what we do know is that much of the narrative we've heard which is that somehow this is all an Iranian ploy, and these are Iranian-backed Shiite rebels who are trying to destabilize this country. That's a patently absurd narrative that needs to be done away with. It's a complex problem. We've had a role in helping create it. The Arab Spring brought a lot of change, as it has in other countries in the region, and some of that has been welcome, some of that has been unwelcome. America clearly has interests in this region. This is the country where the USS Cole was bombed. Folks remember that incident. But it's a lot more complex than we understand, and we need to be very careful before we rush to judgment.
And I think, I just want to go back to one point you made, which I think was so important, which is because I've interviewed people from the Pakistani regions, that I've interviewed their Minister of Human Rights and so on. The psychological impact, we know the psychological impact of, innocent people have been killed by drones, as well as people who suspected of being terrorists. We know the impact it had on us when we were attacked unexpectedly on 9/11 and at other times. So they are dealing with that psychological pressure. It is destabilizing, and it doesn't win us friends. So it's something that people need to really understand and internalize going forward. I've also heard, I've never been to Yemen, but I've heard from people who've been there that there are beautiful parts of the country, very nice people. The other thing we need to remember is that we're dealing with human beings in all of these places, and there are, we've seen the worst of the sort of extremism in that part of the world, but we need to remember there are good, decent people everywhere, and we need to be thinking about their best interests, which happen to align with our own. I mean, that would be my editorial comment. Let's talk for a minute, Stephen Miles of Win Without War, about what's going on here in the United States. Our president is attempting to negotiate with Iran over nuclear issues. Just in a minute or so, what's going on with the politicking and the posing in Congress? And what should people be telling their representatives?
Well, if you ever needed an example of why it was important to support diplomacy and support the president's diplomatic efforts to resolve the challenges and concerns around the Iranian nuclear program with diplomacy and not with war, examine the last 30 minutes of our conversation to see the consequences of the last time we didn't exhaust diplomacy and we went to war over weapons of mass destruction. I mean, this is the reality of what we're talking about, is we can, and there are people in this city and in this country who want to do exactly to Iran what we did to Iraq. And frankly, it would have even more dire consequences than what we've just been talking about. The reason this is on display here in Washington is that it appears, by most measures, that we are very close to the potential for a good diplomatic deal. Now, there are people who don't want to see the president succeed for any reason, folks like John Boehner, who would do anything they could to see the president not succeed. And then there are folks who have other different interests, and for them it's not really about the Iranian nuclear program, it's really about regime change. You know, Senator Cotton, amongst others, has said we really need to be in the business of regime change in Iran. And so they aren't particularly excited about the notion of a nuclear deal that solves with a problem diplomatically and doesn't involve the U.S. launching a regime change war in Iran, because that's what they want to see.
And there are many reasons, as we know, for that, including economic and political and cultural and everything else, because we are a culture too, just as these countries are. So I think we should leave it there. Stephen Miles, Advocacy Director of Win Without War, you put it extremely well. If we don't want a larger repeat of what we've seen in Iraq, we better try to give diplomacy a chance in Iran. Stephen, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, RJ. Have a good day and a nice long weekend.
You too. This is Richard RJ Eskow, and we will be back. This is The Zero Hour.